Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Imagination Podcast. I'm your host, Tony Blair, and this is sponsored by the PhD and ThD programs at Kairos University. Today, we have with us a special guest. We've been looking this spring at people who are helping us reimagine, maybe thinking outside the box, being a little provocative. This one is a fellow scholar that I got to meet in this program over the past several years, who has this incredible. I was just complimenting him before we began this. Has this incredibly gracious way of introducing provocative ideas and making us think, but without making us necessarily get uncomfortable in our thinking, just giving us the opportunity to ponder what God may be up to. So, this is Dr. Geoff Brusch, a graduate of this same program, by the way, for those of you who are in this and are participating in the podcast because of that. Welcome today, Geoff.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure to be a partner, a conversation partner with you. I've had that opportunity with this. We started down this pathway a couple of weeks ago when I did something on the nature of sin, and I was focusing on sin in the Christian life and pushing up against that old idea that we still maintain a sinful nature, much of which is rooted in Romans 7, and I think there's a reinterpretation of it. I didn't get much beyond that. I just want to reinterpret Romans 7, but the implication is maybe to free Christians from having to believe that we have a lifelong battle with this sinful nature inside of us that we will never entirely conquer. I'm a little more optimistic about human nature than that. You go further.
Amen.
You go further than me with this, however, because you want to take it back to origins, to where we started, and to the nature of all humanity, and maybe help us discover something that's even more hopeful than what we've dreamt of for 1600 years, most
Mm.
Christians. So, with that little intriguing lead in, how about if I invite you to tell us what your central premise, hope, argument it is,
Sure.
and then let's unpack that a little bit.
Well, I think first, if I may, real briefly, anytime you're pushing up against 1600 years of uh, a received and formational doctrine, I want people, your listeners, the people who are watching, I want to be very gentle with your hearts. This is a very formational doctrine. Um, for us, at least in the West, we are formed by this idea that we're born and formed in sin because of Adam's fall. And it is something that I've discovered over the past couple of years, just talking with people. People can get pretty angry when you even attempt to ask a question. And so my hope is that, just like your podcast, just to get us to sort of reimagine, is this the only way of interpreting scripture? Is this what the writer was trying to tell us? And so with those
Well,
questions,
if I can interrupt you for because you're raising a really excellent point here. Before we go to the cognitive, to the ideas, you want us to pay attention to the emotions. There's
for
fear
sure.
connected to this discussion about the nature of sin. Why is that, do you think?
I think because it's the foundational idea behind the idea in many branches of our Christianity. It explains why Christ. Why did Christ come? If Christ didn't come to remove my sinful nature, then we need another reason for why he came. And so it sort of attacks our view of Christianity at the without original sin. Many people would ask that question. I think there were many people on my team that pushed me to think through that entailment of reimagining original sin. Are you saying that Christ didn't need to die?
Is there also perhaps here some fear that if we do not hold tightly to an understanding of sin as part of our nature, that
Mm.
we will have license to do whatever we want?
I think so.
Is
Yeah.
that what I mean? Augustine's the one who came up with this doctrine. So, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about here, we're talking about the doctrine of original sin, which, by the way, was developed in the form that most people hold on to it now, about 400 years into the story. So, we're not talking
Right.
about
Right.
biblical revelation or whatever. People find it in the Bible, others do not. Geoff is going to give us an argument there, but I think part of Augustine's argument when he developed this was a fear of his own temptations.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think all of us theologians form our beliefs in our context.
And out of our experience.
For sure, for
We
sure.
we find mental our ideas to come up to justify what we have experienced for ourselves, and often it's an emotional response first that we need to find a cognitive. I'm going off on a tangent there a little bit, but you started off really well by pointing out that there's an emotional element to even having a conversation like this, and
Yeah,
perhaps what we as listeners need to do here is say, okay, what emotions am I noticing
hmm.
inside myself as these guys talk about this?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the folks that I do chat with do have emotional responses, and for the reasons that we've talked about, for sure. And I think maybe other people just don't want to be wrong. You know, their entire framework is shattered just by asking a question, but that's probably part of our reality too.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah,
Well, it could be that you're wrong and you need to be
absolutely,
them.
absolutely.
But I love the fact that you're willing to ask the question and to reimagine. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good place to start. Is this is a reimagining, not a throwing of the baby out with the bathwater. I honor, I quote Augustine extensively, even though I disagree with much of of his conclusions. He had some really good stuff. He's a brother. I don't want to harm anybody's heart on their journey. Um, but as I've reread the story for years and years and years, I wonder if this framework of the things that we've extracted from the story in Genesis 3 could be looked at differently. And, you know, particularly when you pay attention to a lot of the Hebrew words. I am not a Hebrew scholar. I know how to use some tools and lexicons um, but when you look at the way that God created us, that phrase, Tselem Elohim, this word image of God,
Mhm.
it's not strictly a biblical idea, this idea of image that Tony, you and I have discussed at length
Yes.
before, but it's a word that was used in all the ancient Near Eastern cultures to describe um, sculptures and statues that religious people would form and place in their temples. And these statues and sculptures would represent the deity that they were worshiping. And so we have this idea that
You haven't yet used the hot button word here yet, but you're gonna use it here in a minute, aren't you?
I'm not sure which one.
Idols.
Idols. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I've been trying to avoid that because that is a hot button. Yes, yes, it's footnoted in my dissertation because I think our culture has taken that word and we use it quite often in a negative way, rightly so. But these idols or icons or images were real, tangible, plastic things that even kings would create, and they would spread them around their all the lands that they were over to remind people that the presence of the king is here. And so I just asked the question with such a ubiquitous meaning of that term image within the Middle East, could it be that the writers of Genesis were trying to speak into their culture and saying, all of these images that you all see, no, we are God's idols, icons, images. And with all of the theological work done on the Garden of Eden really being temple language, God has placed his idols, his icons within his temple to manifest his being into this world. I think that's where we need to begin any discussion on sin. As you've often said, our story doesn't begin in Genesis 3, it begins in Genesis 1.
Yeah, we always have to, and we can because continue to argue that anthropology, particularly theological anthropology, is the defining discipline of our era. Everything we're fighting about in the church and in the world has to do with the nature of humanity. And it's time that we do ask these questions again and go back and look at the text and go, oh my goodness, how have I been reading that?
Yeah.
Now, I think part of your argument is that since Augustine, or maybe Augustine borrowing from Tertullian, had
Mm,
been reading Genesis 3 through the lens of law. We've been
yes.
using legal metaphors and structures which are not present in the text.
Right.
There is an artistic framework that is, and you're touching on that here a little bit right now. Do you want to develop that a little further for us?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. When we read the text and we look at the words for create, there are three, maybe four different words that get all translated into make or made into our English texts. These are all words that resonate with art. This is exactly what artists do. They are creating something from other elements, combining and releasing something new that is more than the sum of its parts into reality. And so this is the language that we see in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, where when God began to create, and I can't pronounce the word, but it's B-A-R-A, bara. This is a word that has oftentimes been used to describe creating out of nothing. That's a debate for a whole nother day, but in essence, it's God um, separating and mixing and pulling together and bringing order to a chaotic state of being. And then it moves into asa, how he makes humanity. These are all words that resonate with sculptures and art. And there is no law um, in the text really that I can find. I'd be willing to be shown if there is, but from my studies, what I've seen is this is more like God's cosmic art studio, and He's pulling in the beauty of His imagination, and He's painting with the different colors and His character into this new reality that we get to inhabit.
And when he's done, he doesn't say it's very right,
Mm.
moral sense, right? He says it's very good, which is an artistic judgment, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember a sermon I think that you preached on, or a
Oh, dear.
series on Tove. And there are many different ways that that word can be applied for sure. And one of them is aesthetics, beauty. It's beautiful. It is the way that it's supposed to be because it's beautiful and in order and good. Yeah, he didn't, you're right. That's a good point. He didn't step back and say, this will pass the bar, in a legal sense. It was just beautiful.
So, what happened then
Mm,
when in Genesis 3, then when that
yeah.
first sin that's recorded for us happens? And I'll invite this out of you. You have this incredible analogy
Mm.
that you use from Michelangelo, and I'll just let you develop that if you want. But I think that that was just beautiful the way that you've developed that as a way of understanding what happened to humans because of sin.
So I love the word vandalized. And, obviously, um, in my writing and in my work, to whatever degree theologians will allow me to, I'm taking this as a real story. So we have to stay within the bounds of these are real people that this happened in history. And Adam and Eve are created and they're living in the presence of God, and He's teaching them and mentoring them and loving them and walking with them. And in his cosmic art studio, and there's a rival artist who enters the studio, the serpent. And he is shrewd and he's smart and he's wise. And what we have are these two icons of God who, in many tellings in the eastern part of our faith, Eve is tricked. She's beguiled. She's overcome. And this this beautiful thing that God has created is vandalized from an enemy, from a rival artist. It's not something within these people that is springing forth in rebellion. That's another thing I don't find like literally in the text. We can read it out of it, but we don't see as many of my blessed brother preachers, Adam rose up in rebellion and shook his fist at God and wanted to usurp him. We see confusion, disobedience for sure, a lot of chaos. And these icons now are attacked by this rival artist and they remain, but all of this other stuff starts becoming part of the reality. And so I'm not exactly sure about the Michelangelo analogy, but what is often said is that he always saw the statue in the slab of marble, and every stroke that he made was just removing what didn't belong to reveal what always was.
I reviewed your dissertation before our conversation just to make sure I was remembering your argument a little bit. And you had, I think it was in there, this image of what if somebody broke into the museum. I'm trying to remember where that's at, if that's in the Vatican or
Oh,
whatever. Yeah,
oh, the
and just start
Piata.
of the yes,
Yes. Okay. Yeah. 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 So there's this beautiful, huge sculpture of, it's called
that's
the
right.
Piata, and it's
They,
Mary holding the slain body of Jesus. And I think it was in the 70s, this man who was having some issues ran into this museum and declared himself to be Christ. And he took a hammer and he busted off Mary's nose and her arm and really damaged this beautiful picture. And I think that's a good analogy of what has happened to humanity. Um, we have been attacked, we have been vandalized, and the it went all the way up to the Pope to make a decision as to whether they should even try to repair this beautiful sculpture and because they realized how delicate and how difficult and how much care would go into repairing this beautiful sculpture, and they decided that they would. And so I think I have a picture of the damage and then a beautiful full color picture of the restored image. And that's what Christ does in and for us.
so if Christ restores us, to what extent do we still bear the marks of our vandalism in your understanding? Do we
Yeah.
still sin?
Hmm. So, how much time now? I
I don't want to put you
loved,
on the spot, but these are the
I
implications
love
of,
it.
yeah.
So, oh boy, I just had a thought that was going to be great, and it's no. So your podcast on the Christian life. Oh, here it is. I think that we need to have an honest discussion about what we mean by like nature. So, if we had a lion in this podcast and we put steak and hay in front of it, I would guess 100% of the time this lion is going to eat the steak because that's his instinct, that's his nature. But humans aren't animals like a lion is. We've been given agency and the ability to choose, the ability to decide. And so I would say that we are works in progress, masterpieces in the making that never had that binary, I must sin, I must sin. We have a human nature, not an animal instinct nature. And so even as Christians, I believe that we can be deceived, we can choose wrongly. So I don't think that it's our nature in that definition that we're struggling against something that we can not do.
One of the things that complicates things for us, particularly in Western Christianity, is the early founders, the earliest theologians were Greek, and they thought in Greek categories, and you use Greek language like nature. That's a word
Yeah.
that was used by them in ways that we don't, that doesn't translate as well in the 21st century America. Persons of the
Mm,
Trinity, that kind of language, and
yeah.
substance. And there are some things there that make it a little difficult for us at this point to do so. The good news is, of course, that this heritage of this Western Christianity, while so valuable to us in many respects, isn't the only way that Christians have understood this, and particularly have the way they've understood sin.
Right.
There are other
Right.
traditions. I know you did a little work on that. There are other traditions, Celtic tradition, the Eastern tradition, that looked at this a little differently from almost the very beginning. Is there
Yeah.
anything you wanted to say about what they have to bring to the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is really healing it has been healing for me, and I hope that it is for others. Those Greek church early folks often looked at sin as if it were more of a disease unto death, which if we want to ask our biblical friends, that's biblical language. Like, can we just stick to that? And this disease comes with a death sentence. And we all enter into that. Uh, whether sin is inevitable, I think our objective reality would say probably so. We all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so we all have this death sentence, and death can be used in many different ways. Um, but they would look at sin as like a disordered love. Um, an inward focused love rather than loving others and loving God, as Jesus said is the greatest commandment, and we uphold all the rest when we do that. It's an inward focused thing, a selfish thing, and it's a disease that causes us to die emotionally, spiritually, physically. And so sin is a real thing. It's a real problem. It's a lot more important than just behavioral modification. It is an enemy. And Christ, in that telling of the story, is the one who takes our sickness upon himself. He dies our death. He conquers death in his resurrection and drags all of us along with him. And so it's truly good news.
I've been arguing for quite some time our gospel is better than sometimes we think it is, and therefore we're not offering. No wonder the world is less interested in receiving it. The gospel is that we're bound in a sinful nature, we will never be totally free from it. But once we're in Christ, we know that we've got to struggle, and it's a lifelong struggle. That doesn't sound very good.
Right.
But that's again, that was a couple of weeks ago. You're suggesting here instead that perhaps where we started off with is a piece of magnificent artwork that's been vandalized by the enemy. We have volition, we have choice, we've allowed that, we continue to allow that, but being restored and becomes a relational.
Right. That's
To,
right.
I think I'm hearing you say more than a juridical one, more than the courtroom analogies that we have become very fond of.
Yeah, I think so. And I would to be gracious, I do think that Paul slips into a few courtroom type analogies. And so I'm not saying that our Christian faith is like a smorgasbord, pick what you want. But if a person needs that kind of analogy that resonates with their personality, it's there. But I think that the arc of Scripture, and I just recently was rereading Paradise Lost by John Milton. And my goodness, what a lot of poetic license. But if the lawyers, if the judges are allowed to put their frameworks onto our story, can we at least leave room for the poets too, who saw this fall of humanity as something like the greatest love story never told?
Well, the word fall isn't in the story either, is it?
That's right. That's
I
right.
remember the moment, it's probably been 10 years ago now, but it's been that recent in my career when I had this revelation about what happened when they left Eden. They were still the
Mm,
man and the woman. They didn't have personal names until they left.
right.
That God went with them out of Eden.
Yeah. How
I,
cool
I,
is that?
I'm amazed that I had never thought of that before. This impression was that they were banished from the sight of God, and God remained in Eden, and they were cast out into. Well, actually, Eden was the name of the region, and in the story, and the garden was in Eden. It
In
was
Eden.
not the name of the garden, but they got released. They got dismissed out into Eden, out into the world. But it was God went with them out into it. So, one of the ways that the Eastern Church made sense of this, and you pick up on this, is that what happened to them was, well, in the language of someone who I forget right now, maybe it was Irenaeus, this was anticipatory disobedience, that they
Mm,
were always intended to
mm,
grow to the point of maturity where they would be able to choose between good and evil, as
yeah.
represented by that tree. But they jumped the gun, like maybe 12-year-old kids seizing the car keys and smashing the car. Um, but there would have been time if they waited when they could drive the car. Maybe that's the mature Christian life we're being invited to. Is that fair? Is that
Yeah.
analogy workable here for us?
Yeah. I think that that makes the most sense of the text. Personally, if if God was being truthful, which he was when he stepped back and said over his creation, "It is good," then even that tree of the knowledge of good and evil was part of his good creation. And so his prohibition on that in much of the early Eastern way of thinking was that that wasn't permanent, that this was a goal that they would grow
Mm.
toward as they were maturing in their relationship with God, that that knowledge of good and evil is the thing in Genesis 3 that God himself says, oh my goodness, now they are just like us. Now we have to prevent them from eating from the tree of life. And so I do think that it's a great way of putting it. You know, the 14-year-old who wants to drive just doesn't have the ability to do it properly yet. But at some point, he or she will. And I think that that is great for psychology. It's great for
Mm.
sociology that this is something that we're growing into the image of Christ, that God would have brought us into at some point in time. And they believed the voice, which I think we still sometimes do, of somebody that they thought was wise, and they jumped the gun.
Then being exiled from Eden becomes less punishment and more
Hmm.
protection, right? Just like
Amen.
you're not allowed to be in the driver's seat in the car anymore. You're you're exiled from that because you are not trustworthy with that yet. We're going to have to wait to a further level of development before we can go there again.
I mean, I'm getting goosebumps just listening. Yes, that is the heart of God to protect and preserve his people. And so, had he allowed them at that stage to become immortal, as the story goes, um, would they have been locked in this perpetual state of infantile disobedience? And so he protects them and goes with them out into the world and doesn't take away his sort of mandate to, I love this word, to Edenize the rest of
Mm.
creation, which may have been part of the goal to begin with. You know, they started out in this little garden, but um, the role of the human is to expand out and turn it all into Eden.
And he does not curse them.
Right.
We get confused about that too. There's no curse on the man and the woman. There are consequences. I tend to prefer to think of those consequences as descriptive rather than prescriptive. This
Amen.
is not
Amen.
God mandating forever that this is the way it should be, particularly the domination of the man over the woman. We see that in much of history, but the degree to which we can, with the spirit, reverse that, we are helping to
Yes.
restore Eden,
Yes.
not violating it.
My denomination is currently getting ready to vote on that very thing based on that understanding of the hierarchical curse, which isn't there. It is descriptive of what's going on outside of Eden. Um, yeah, yeah. It's the thing about the thorns that I've recently been reimagining too is yeah, there's thorns and thistles, and this is a consequence of living outside of Eden. But Jesus comes and he takes up those thorns and wears them as a crown.
Mm.
Like he doesn't ignore the reality of what sin brings into our world, what disobedience. He doesn't ignore those consequences. He crowns them. Like I know that this is a horrible, horrible, very brute example, but it's he's like an X-Man who takes all of the bad and the evil and the brokenness inside of himself and just absorbs it and blows it up. So powerful.
That's awesome. Well, we want to wrap this up here in another minute or two, but there was one point of this that um, I was headed toward, and then got sidetracked a little bit because we talked about the Eastern contribution to this understanding of sin in the early centuries, but there was also the Celtic contribution. And a number of modern scholars are looking at this conversation, this debate between Augustine and Pelagius.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
been
yeah.
tarred and feathered by history as really a conversation between Celtic and Augustine anthropologies, because the Celtic Christians were more optimistic, more hopeful about human nature than the version that Augustine represented, which I continue to argue represents perhaps his own struggle. His own, we know his autobiography. He gave us the first autobiography, so we know more about his inner life than we do. We don't know much about the actual thoughts that played just because his writings didn't survive. All we have are the condemnations. But what
Right.
if that's the case? What if it is that we have different understandings of human nature that have emerged by 300 years or so after Christ? And one got shouted down and became
Yeah.
the dominant view, and 1600 years later we still think it's the only view, and there's this other one that's been there the whole time that maybe is calling out for our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have some very close Catholic friends who wouldn't even consider Celtic Christianity part of Christianity. So
Mm-hmm.
that's disappointing. But a lady in England by the name of Ali Bonner, I think 2 years ago, it wasn't out when I needed it, but she wrote a book called The Myth of Pelagianism. And you're
Mm-hmm.
right, like we don't have his writings, just what Augustine argued against, claiming he said these things. And she goes through this really long, 400-page book showing that Pelagius may have said half of one of the 12 points that Augustine argues against. Like Augustine was creating a new orthodoxy by arguing against a straw man. Now, that's another challenging thought that I will get, castigated for, but get her book.
Well, a similar thing happened with Origen. There was a
Yeah,
later council which Origenism was condemned, but how much Origenism actually represented the views of Origen is still subject to debate. He too
right,
was an imaginative, creative thinker, and in those early centuries, they had to be, because they
right.
were asking questions that nobody had tried to answer before, and they were sorting it out
Yeah, yeah.
in a variety of ways. Well, let's pull this to a close, just so we don't go on too long for those who will be listening into this a little bit later. Geoff, I love the fact that you're thinking outside the box. I don't know what to do with some of this myself. There's some speculation here, but
There
I
is.
love the fact that you have given us something hopeful with a spirit that is gracious, with scholarship that seems to be deeply rooted in the text and in the ancient world. It's worth listening to. It's worth thinking about. It's worth
Thank you.
examining how we understand our own selves, much less the people around us. This is the kind of thinking we need to do now. Thanks for being brave enough to invite the rest of us into your own inner dialogue on all of this.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share it. There's not many who will, so thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Now, this is what we want to do. I got so quickly into the discussion of the thing, I forgot to do the full introduction
That's
here,
okay.
by the way. Geoff is pastor at Arvon Baptist Church. He works as a hospice chaplain. He's got a lovely family, and you have a book coming out. So let's give you the last word. Tell us about your book in case anybody is it related to this,
It's
or is it something?
it's very much my dissertation work permeates the entire thing.
Yeah,
I intentionally tried to do a non-academic sort of lay reader level work to help people overcome the nasty shame that so much of what we're talking about really elicits in us. And so it's called Being Seen: How God Reveals and Restores Humanity to Real Life. And it's being published by Width and Stock probably in a month or two. So, yeah.
but let's be on the lookout for that. Being seen,
Hmm.
how God restores humanity to say it again.
To real life. And real
Real
is I love thinking in acronyms. And so it's REAL, and they all stand for something very important. So,
life. That's awesome. Wonderful. And anybody listening to this podcast will have the odd spelling of your name there in front of them so they can look you up as author. I don't want anybody to miss that. I think that will be awesome.
thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Geoff, for doing this. And thanks again for everybody who's listened into this. And if you are feeling perplexed or bothered in any way, there's I think an invitation to grace. You can just toss all this out the window if you want, but
Absolutely.
there's
Absolutely.
also the invitation to ponder a little bit and say, is there something in here God would have me to hear the result of this? So that's why we do it. Blessings.
Thank you, Tony.